make it long, I'll give now the floor to Mrs. Sanja Mađarevich Šuјstер, senior economist for the Western Balkan countries and country economist in the World Bank for North Macedonia. Sanja, I would like to ask you, and additionally on what you say in the first part of today's discussion, we spoke about it is a challenge to link good governance and fiscal rules with concrete reforms. That is not an unknown mechanism for the World Bank. The WB has mechanisms for budget support that are linked with the reforms. But among others, I'd like to ask you how it is challenging now in such a crisis time to implement such mechanisms, in particular knowing that the fiscal room, not only of Macedonia, but all countries of the WB is limited. And on the other hand, we require both growth, but also fiscal consolidation. Please.
First, thank you, Victor. My apology for not being able to. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I couldn't come today in person. Unfortunately, COVID is still present, and a lot of traveling doesn't help with not being exposed to such viruses. But this is a new normal. Thank you for inviting me to this convention. I think communication among different stakeholders is extremely important, in particular during the pre-accession time, and having more involvement of the civil society and non-governmental institutions in the process of pre-accession, I think helps a lot. It did help to the country I come from, Croatia, because these are small countries, the capacities are limited, and therefore extending the government capacity by relying on non-governmental sector is extremely helpful. Understanding where you want to go during this pre-accession process and also post-accession is extremely important, so that every single sector of the economy can contribute to this goal. So I have prepared a small presentation. I don't know whether I can share the screen. I hope.
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you very much. And I hope you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to kind of step back why based rules, fiscal policy is important. Where we are today in North Macedonia, post-crisis, we are in a situation of growth, potential growth being lower than in the pre-crisis period, and I'm thinking of multiple sequence crises that we have experienced since 2020. And we are also in a situation when inflation remains sticky, something that has also not been seen for a couple of decades. So having a very close coordination of fiscal and monetary policies and proper sequencing is extremely important, so that the both authorities in a way work in sync in order to, on one side, understand where we are in the cycle, help with taming the inflationary expectations, but on the other side also not to kill growth by restrictive, policies. Darko, can you please turn off the mic, because I can hear you in parallel. Secondly, the financing costs have surged. Today, North Macedonia is experiencing six-fold higher interest payments on its borrowing from abroad, and this calls, for the reduction of the gross financing needs. Otherwise, the interest payments, which are already rising and taking a high allocation of budgetary resources, will grow even further. Third, Victor mentioned, what is important is that while you rebuild this, strengthen the fiscal sustainability and also try to rebuild fiscal buffers for any future shocks, it is important to safeguard those spending that would deliver higher sustainable growth, because this would also then boost revenue base and also help with the consolidation. So it's not either or. It should be a coordinated approach to safeguard those productive elements of the spending that would then lift the revenue base in the future. So what we are suggesting is that the fiscal strategy needs to be designed for both recovery and stabilization. And there are 4 elements to it. One is that the debt needs to be, so short-term debt needs to be stabilized, and also fiscal buffers need to be rebuilt. North Macedonia is the country which has not really reduced much the deficit since 2020, even compared to the region. Overall, we are in a cycle of the fiscal deficit around 5% on average since 2020. Secondly, the PFM institutions, public finance management institutions, need to be strengthened, including imposing the fiscal rules as well as having independent fiscal oversight. And this is important not only for the country, but also important for ensuring investors, in particular into your Eurobonds, that there is a continuity of the fiscal policy, that it is credible, it will not erode sustainability of and the repayment capacity in the future. Third part needs to deal with the revenue mobilization, and in this area, it's not only focus on tax policy adjustments, but also on improving collection and compliance, which is eroded by very high informality. And fourth, focus needs to be also, and not least important, needs to be on addressing spending inefficiencies. We found that with the same allocation of spending, the country can deliver better results in the spending areas. And this is also important so that this additional spending, wasted spending, can be used for supporting the green transition. And now through few charts. One, which I mentioned earlier, is that we haven't seen much of the decline in fiscal deficit since 2020. And this has also led to a very sticky public debt. And you could see that in our latest regular economic report, most of the countries, even in the region, in the Western Balkan region, have been able to reduce deficits to below 3% last year. And even this year, they will be also around 3%. So this was not the case in North Macedonia. The country is not different in terms of structure so much that would call for larger fiscal deficits to be present, in particular not after the inflation has also boosted revenue collection. So this is important to have in mind, and as a short-term priority, reducing the deficit and reducing the debt would be needed. I'm sorry. Why reducing the debt? If you compare the country with the EU peers, you can still argue that the debt level is moderate compared to the peer countries. However, peer countries like small EU states, in fact, are on the left part of this chart rather than on the right part of the chart. And the red column presents North Macedonia in 2013 and in 2020, and you could see a sharp rise in public general government debt, public debt as GDP ratio. So the country clearly now went into the direction of states which had over several years, even some of them even decades, problems with reducing their indebtedness. However, these are also countries that belong to the Eurozone, which North Macedonia is not part of it. So in a way, these countries are protected, safeguarded against the increased financing cost by being a members of Eurozone. This is not the case for North Macedonia, and therefore we also see a surge in financing costs for the borrowing abroad. Secondly, the country also needs to improve the credit rating. It now belongs to the non-investment credit rating group and hasn't seen any changes over the last couple of years. So improving the credit rating would be also important to reduce sovereign risk premium. This is important not only for refinancing of the government debt, but also for reducing the financing costs for private sector. So to recap, why is fiscal consolidation needed? What we argue should be a short-term priority. One is to put public debt growth on a sustainable path, retaining macro stability. Secondly, as you prepare for the EU accession, you would need to create fiscal space that would be needed to absorb EU funds, but also to contribute to the EU budget. And you may think this is a distant future, but if the aspirations are for accession in 2030, you need to know that in the first few years upon accession, in the, let's say first 3 years, the countries have been, all countries, no exceptions, have been net contributors to the EU budget because they were not of the capacity to absorb multifold increase in EU funds that fast to be able to compensate for what is a mandatory contribution to the EU budget. And this is the share of your VAT revenues. I'm sorry, I really apologize. That would be immediately withdrawn to the EU budget and also your co-financing of the EU projects, EU-funded projects. So there is a co-financing at least of 25%, in some cases even 50% of the EU grant-funded projects. So based on even experience of my country, but also countries that joined the EU in 2004, 2007, the first few years, 3 years upon the accession, they have seen a net fiscal impact of EU accession of minus 1.4, minus 1.3% of GDP a year. So de facto, you're losing approximately 1.2 to 1.4% of GDP because simply the countries were not able to absorb as fast the new available EU grant funding. This, of course, changes over time. And then over time, approximately 70% of overall public investments would be covered by EU grant funding. But this takes time, and it is important to build the absorption capacity for that. And third important element or argument for the fiscal consolidation is that you need to create buffers for aging-related costs. This is important to ensure against the long-term shocks, but you also see that the deficit of your pension system is growing rapidly even now. We also, in the discussion with the government, are discussing what fiscal strategy is needed for recovery and stabilization. And here I want to repeat several of the points I made earlier. One is that current crisis response measures need to be better targeted, and the effectiveness needs to be enhanced and gradually withdrawn, because we are not anymore in the dire crisis situation. Secondly, the public revenue needs to be mobilized not only by widening of the tax base in a non-regressive way, but also scale up all the efforts to fight avoidance and evasion of taxes. Third, composition and efficiency of spending needs to be improved. And here the focus really needs to be to allocating more space for capital spending, and in particular for green investments to avoid such adverse impact of future energy shocks. Primary deficit needs to be permanently reduced in order to stem further public debt growth. And last but not the least, the fiscal rule needs to be enforced, not already called for the escape clauses before the rule is even introduced, and the fiscal council needs to be operationalized. Fiscal rules currently in North Macedonia align with the Maastricht criteria, and also many countries have similar rules. However, there are several several issues with how you will interpret these rules. One is that the statistics and the fiscal statistics is not aligned with the ESA 2010 as yet. If such alignment would happen, this would lead to an increase in spending equal to about at least 3% of GDP, because the coverage of the general government would also need to be expanded towards some of the state-owned companies that are performing fiscal functions and are not able to cover these functions with own revenues in excess of 50% of its spending. So this is number one. Number two is that also the country is not yet applying the accrual-based accounts. And if you look at the trends of public sector arrears over time, since 2018, they are observing, since 2019, they're observing growth. I think in June this year, they were approximately 3.2% of GDP. So this increase in the stock of arrears would also need to be added to the current deficit trajectory. And ESA 2010 also requires that you take into account the accrual-based measures of the deficit. Third issue with the fiscal rules is that you need to project the trajectory of and enforcement of the rules before knowing really how your gross domestic product will perform for a particular year. So if you have an optimistic bias in terms of projections, then you may end up in a position where you would argue that the fiscal rules is being achieved with the budget proposed, but de facto ex post, this would not be the case. We have seen this optimistic focus bias omnipresent throughout years in North Macedonia. So having accurate economic and fiscal forecasting would be extremely important. And last but not the least, the medium-term planning, although it is in place, still requires further improvements, because the medium-term plans, as presented in fiscal strategies, are usually not immediately reflected even in that current budget proposal. The last point I want to make is that fiscal rules are extremely important, but their oversight is even more. So what the practice has shown, and many research papers have done on that account, is that yes, having strong fiscal rules fosters fiscal discipline. The more they are entrenched in the constitution or in laws that require a higher majority, the better. The more they are monitored by independent agencies, the better, and they are stronger in terms of enforcement. But also, I think what is clear is that if these fiscal rules enjoy public support and are monitored by the overall public, compliance with these rules becomes very politically important, and therefore it would be more difficult for the authorities to breach fiscal rules. So the public perception of rules is extremely important as well. What's coming up in the new fiscal governance framework in the EU is the fact that the fiscal councils will have fiscal boards, as you wish, would have stronger role in terms of their functions to enforce the rules, to assess the forecast, look at the debt sustainability. And I would argue that North Macedonia has a good perspective to set this institution right. All three members of the council have independence. They have also been selected by independent institutions, have a capacity to understand the fiscal policy, and therefore I'm really looking forward to see the institution starting from a good position immediately. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanja.